Hello, my name is Ben Stewart, and we will be talking about stress today. This is part one of four, and in this podcast, we'll be talking about the history and theory of stress. Hans Zellier was a researcher in the 1940s. He was attempting to discover a new sex hormone by injecting ovarian extracts into rats. As his study progressed, he found that the rats all developed three structural changes. These changes were enlargement of the cortex of the adrenal gland, atrophy of the thymus gland and other lymphoid tissues, and ulceration of the gastrointestinal tract. They were very uncomfortable rats. Hans Ehle discovered that these three structural changes occurred in rats subjected repeatedly to noxious stimuli. Specifically, he found noxious stimuli to be cold, surgery, restraints, or foot shocks. He termed the noxious stimuli stressors. Stress has been defined as the state of affairs arising when a person relates to, or interacts or transacts with, situations in a certain way. The way a person appraises and reacts to situations has a profound impact on stress. The nervous and endocrine systems react to stressors and attempt to restore the body to its previous normal functioning, or what we call homeostasis. Modern society is full of stress. You can see a few stressors in this picture here. Here are a few more examples of specific stressors that exist. There are a lot more possibilities. Zelia identified three components of physiological stress: the stressor itself, the physiologic or chemical disturbance produced by the stressor, and the body's adaptational response to the stressor. We'll be talking about each one of these. Zellier believed that the three physiologic changes noted in rats were caused by a nonspecific physiologic response to any long-term stressor. He called this response the general adaptation syndrome. Nonspecific meaning that the body responds in the same way to any noxious stimuli or stressor. Hans Zellier's general adaptation syndrome occurs in three stages: the alarm stage, the stage of resistance or adaptation, and the stage of exhaustion. The alarm stage begins your classic fight or flight response. The body's defenses are aroused. Arousal occurs as the stressor activates the central nervous system. The central nervous system, in turn, activates the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. We will talk more specifically about each one of these systems in a little bit. The resistance or adaptation stage mobilizes the body's resources in order to continue the fight or flight response. Adrenal hormones triggered by the activation of the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis control the body's responses during this stage. And this is controlled through the hormones cortisol, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. If stress continues and the adaptation stage does not result in a return to homeostasis, the body may progress to the exhaustion stage. In this stage, the stressors overload the compensatory mechanisms of the body, a process called allostatic overload. As the body becomes more exhausted and more overloaded, stress leads to an impaired immune response, heart failure, kidney failure, or even death. We now know that, although important, the physiological view of stress, as outlined in the general adaptation syndrome, is an oversimplified model of stress response. Zellier believed that stress was a purely physiological response in response to purely physiological stimuli. Recent research has found that psychological stressors also trigger the stress response. The modern non-specific physiological responses consist of interaction among the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system and other neural signals that activate the endocrine system known as the HPA axis. These can result in a physiological reactive response, a psychological reactive response, an anticipatory response, or a conditional response. The nonspecific physiological response is a common response that can be elicited in reaction to a physical stimuli, such as cold, heat, x-rays, adrenaline, insulin, muscular exercise, and many others. Although the reaction to the stimuli is nonspecific, Evidence supports the coexistence of highly specific adaptive reactions to any of these agents also. A physiologic stressor can produce both specific and nonspecific responses. As with physically mediated stress responses, psychologic stressors can elicit a reactive stress response. That is, a physiological response results from a psychological stressor. This is a reaction to an immediate psychological problem, such as a robber breaking into your apartment, or when an unprepared student is taking an examination. Another type of psychologic mediated stress response is the anticipatory response. The stressor is not immediately present, but is impending. An example would be getting stressed about an exam the night before, being stressed before a race starts, or being in a Jurassic Park movie and you've noticed the big meat-eating dinosaur, but it hasn't noticed you. Anticipatory responses are learned responses and are controlled by the person's learning and memory. In a conditional response, a person learns that specific stimuli are associated with danger. The anticipation of a new encounter with that same stimuli produces the physiological stress response. An example of this would be post-traumatic stress disorder, or the white coat syndrome, or even the fear of a dentist. In any of these cases, the presence of the stimuli produces a stress response, such as elevated blood pressure and elevated heart rate. This is the end of the presentation on the history of stress. I would like to just end with a quick question that kind of reviews some of the information that we have discussed, and the answer is on the following slide.